Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Shifting sands and alliances, advances and reversals, outside military interventions, and stalemate. These are among some of the descriptions that apply to the Middle East since the start of the Arab Spring. What are we experiencing in this turbulent region? The end of the West's neo-colonial order, the redrawing of the map, or merely instability and violence with no end in sight? To crosstalk the developments in the Middle East, I'm joined by Hassan in Washington. He is a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And in London, we cross to Zayd Alisa. He is a political analyst and writer. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. So if I can go to you first in Washington, it's been a long 2 years in the greater Middle East, and it all started out by calling it the Arab Awakening. Do you like terms like that anymore? Does it resonate with you, considering what's happened in so many different countries in this very volatile region?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that I've never really considered it actually a useful term from the beginning. One of the things about the Arab Spring and the way people referred to it is that they sort of understood it as a transitional process that would lead to democracy. But ultimately, we had no idea whether that would be the case from the very beginning. So if you talk to people down on the ground in Cairo, in Tunis, etc., what you find is that they refer to their individual revolutions as the Tunisian Revolution, the Egyptian Revolution, the Syrian Civil War. And I think that that's a much better way of referring to it.
Okay, Zayd, how do you feel about using the term Arab Spring, Arab Awakening 2 years on? Because as we just heard, I mean, in each individual country, circumstances are different. But I think one could make the claim that a lot of there are a lot of other issues that they have in common, particularly dictatorship supported by Western powers. I mean, this is one commonality almost all of them have had.
Well, I mean, this is absolutely true. I mean, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that what happened in the Arab region, which started off in Tunisia and then rapidly spread and swept the Arab region, particularly going through Egypt, which is one of the most staunchest and closest ally of the United States, was people actually revolting, standing up to tyrannical regimes, dictatorships, which were wholeheartedly and emphatically supported by the USA. The majority of the regimes were actually true supporters and allies of the United States. And the people in those countries were fed up to the back teeth and were sick and tired of the support and the unlimited, unwavering support to those dictatorships by the United States. We've seen it happening in Tunisia, and then the popular uprisings spread to Egypt, and we've seen the United States, that is Obama, taken aback, and after a lot of posturing, pondering and dithering, he withheld support to Hosni Mubarak, which actually upset one of the other staunchest, most reliable, irreplaceable allies of the United States, which was Saudi Arabia, okay, which thought that that was the ultimate betrayal of another staunch ally, one of the closest allies of the United States. And we've seen that the Saudis never actually forgave the USA for turning its back on Mubarak, but Obama, yeah, in the long run knew that it had the support of the army. So it had a safety net, it had an insurance policy in both Egypt and in Tunisia. That was one of the major reasons that actually the Obama pulled the rug from under the feet of Mubarak, knowing fully well that supporting the army at this important pivotal point would actually win over the confidence, win over the support of the people to the army, which actually took over power and refused to relinquish power. It was only after protests, further protests by the Egyptian people that the army had to relinquish power.
But I think that talks more about indecision and the lack of strategy or even understanding what's going on the ground. Hans, how would you look at how the Western powers, particularly the United States, has dealt with events in the greater Middle East over the last 2 years? Because, you know, we can look at each individual country and their specifics there, but the Obama administration seems to be very unclear on what direction it needs to pursue, because is it democracy, is it security, can you have both?
Well, I think the Obama administration has demonstrated that actually the overall strategy of the United States towards the Middle East is ultimately flawed. It's been flawed. We saw that with 9/11. The Bush administration changed its mind and decided that democracy was the way forward in the region, and then ultimately that was roughly where the Obama administration ended up by the end of 2010 when it done a policy planning review. But now what we see is the Arab Springs fundamentally turned all of that on its head, and we've just seen Susan Rice release a new policy planning review that says that security comes first. And ultimately, I think that that's the United States strategy in the region, that security comes first, not democracy at all.
Okay, Zayd, I think we've come full circle, haven't we? It's amazing. So we have Mubarak back in power under a different name, okay? I don't know what the Arabic version of Punashe is, but okay, we've gone full circle, haven't we? But have the people on the ground benefited from any of this?
No, I mean, the trick is what the Americans have done in going full circle. They refused actually to back up the army, which was what the Saudis demanded, to back up Hosni Mubarak by actually unleashing the army against the people who rose up to defy Mubarak. But by actually allowing the Muslim Brotherhood to take on power and pursue misguided policies that actually convince the people that they are after accumulating and monopolizing power, and the Muslim Brotherhood actually being forced to shift from its moderate teaching to Islam in order to placate the strenuous opposition and vehement oppositions by the Saudis, the actually pursuing more radical Wahhabi Salafi ideology have fallen out of favor by the Egyptian people, who actually turned around and supported the army. So what the Americans have achieved is having the army back in power, and Sisi actually attempting to go and put his name forward to an elections and actually going back full circle. What happened also in the in Yemen and Bahrain was actually Americans giving the Saudis the green light to treat those two countries at their backyard garden.
Zayd, you're covering a lot of topics here at once. I want to talk about Saudi Arabia in a second here, okay? To kind of echo what Zayd had to say, which I think is really very interesting here, is that it looks like that under the guise of democracy or security, whatever flavor you prefer, again, it's rejigging the Middle East, where the United States still maintains a hegemonic role. This is what their ultimate goal is. They don't really care about the coloration of the regime as long as it plays into a security arrangement that Washington can feel comfortable with. And let's not forget Tel Aviv and Riyadh.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think ultimately the security, having a hegemony over the region and stability, whether that comes through democracy or through authoritarian regimes, is ultimately the end game plan, because the United States has too many interests in the region to allow it to fundamentally oppose those interests. So when the United States acts, it always does so with the view of, how does this inform our counterterrorism policy? How does this inform our counter-proliferation policy? How does this inform our energy policy? It's this plethora of issues that comes to the fore with the United States. And ultimately, there's a massive conflict of interest problem that the United States has to deal with when it formulates its Middle East policy.
Well, Oz, if I can stay with you, I guess Benghazi is where everything collides, isn't it? With the assassination of an American ambassador by a country that was liberated by NATO.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the security situation in Libya as it stands right now is fundamentally problematic. What you have is Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb and various other terrorist organizations who are actually able to free flow throughout the region because of a lack of security, border security. And what that does is it adds a whole level of new strategic importance. So if you look at the way in which the United States has tried to deal with the region, it was all positive about democracy up until the Benghazi attacks. And and obviously the simultaneous attacks in Tunisia, the embassy in Tunisia. And it's at that point that the United States really steps back and says, actually, we're going to downgrade our presence in the region, and we're going to start to look towards making sure that the stability and these interests are secured, rather than promoting democracy throughout the region.
That's right. Well,
and I think that ultimately that's a problematic
I think
way
they've
of doing
decided
it.
to stay in the region. Zayd, if I go to you in London, they've decided to stay in the region, just more low profile, through militaries, working with dictatorships where they feel very comfortable working with dictatorships. We have decades of experience working with dictatorships like in Saudi Arabia. It works for Washington.
Actually, if you look at what happened on the ground, they are teaching the people there a lesson. Those people who dared to rise up and defy the dictators who were supported by the America are now facing two options. If you want stability, security, and limited economic progress, then you have to stick with the dictators. If you turn against those dictators, stand up to them, challenge them, and defy them, then what you're going to get is insecurity, instability, more prominence, and a greater role for the Al-Qaeda, and a greater influence and prowess, and also influence for Al-Qaeda in the region. So the people are going to pick stability and security. But if we look at what happened in Benghazi, it was actually the relentless intervention by the Americans. It was this relentless intervention which stripped the popular uprisings of its legitimacy and deprived it and denied it its authenticity. We've seen that the American turn, and also NATO, its air force into an air force which was specifically backing up the rebels. It turned it into their own air force, which followed Muammar al-Gaddafi to Sirte and to Beni Walid, where there was absolutely no
Zayd,
need
I have
for
to
them
jump
to
in
do
here.
that.
Gentlemen, I have to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on events in the Middle East. Stay with our team. I'd like to go back to you in Washington. It was mentioned earlier in the program about Saudi Arabia, and we see a possible reset, some kind of reset with Washington or Saudi Arabia going on its own. That could be just all bluster. Nonetheless, Saudi Arabia is a power broker right now. We saw it with Egypt, and we're seeing it with Syria. We'll talk about Syria in a second. But, you know, is this the kind of country that is going to be the beacon of American democracy for the region? Saudi Arabia? Really?
Well, I think, ultimately, the US-Saudi relationship has always been built on security. It always has been built on security since its founding. And I think, ultimately, that the relationship between security, energy come together. What this means is the US-Saudi relationship is not at a point of divorce. There's a lot of tensions. The Saudis are being far more vocal than they usually are, disagreeing with the United States. It's, ultimately fighting for a position on the UN Security Council and then turning down the position is a clear demonstration effect of how Saudi Arabia is upset. But these two powers aren't at a point of divorce at all. And I think that yes, there are problems that the United States has in dealing with a regime of this sort. But let's not forget other relationships that the United States has throughout the region and various areas where it has been pushing. So, for example, Tunisia, it has been a successful, or looks to be a successful version of transition, of non-violent transition, and the United States does seem to at least be backing the Tunisian regime as it steps forward with its transition process. And it's the same with the European Union as well.
Well,
the European Union has been very
we could talk about Iraq,
Afghanistan,
Libya. My goodness, Tunisia.
I would beg to differ here.
Go ahead, Zayd. Go ahead, jump in. Go ahead.
If I could jump in, what we could see in Tunisia is exactly a repeat or a rerun of what happened in Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood is called An-Nahda, and we've seen actually the same forces, which are the secular forces, the ex-dictatorship supporters, gathering up and actually opposing and standing steadfastly determined to topple the An-Nahda party or the government which is led by An-Nahda party. So what we're witnessing in Tunisia is a rerun of what happened in Egypt. But going back to what happened in Saudi Arabia,
well, I just don't agree with that.
It is inconceivable that what the Saudis have done, that is invade and occupy another country, which is the home of the fifth breed, could have taken place without the full consent of the Americans. And what we've actually seen in Yemen, the Saudis, backed up by the Americans, come up with their own initiative, which ostensibly is called the Gulf Cooperation Council Initiative, which is a Saudi initiative to replace one dictator, that is Saleh, ease him out and replace him by another dictator, which is a staunch ally of Saudi Arabia, that is to protect its own backyard garden. And the invasion of Bahrain and the occupation against the overwhelming majority of the people who stood up to the Bahraini dictatorship, which is, by the way, Al Khalifa family, where the Prime Minister has been there, as long as Muammar Gaddafi has been there, is still supported emphatically and heavily by the Americans.
Zayd, hang on here. Let me let Oz react to that. That was a mouthful there. Go ahead, Oz.
Well, well, I think that ultimately, if you look at what's going on, if you take a short-term analysis and look at the events as they're happening on the ground, you can pick a lot of things that look as if these transitions are undergoing a trauma. But actually, there are more positive steps. There's constitutions being negotiated. There's national dialogues being undertaken. These are all positive things. They are new things in the region, and ultimately they point towards a more democratic transition for that region. Let's not forget that the Arab Spring is a crisis moment in international politics. It is the moment in which you cannot put the genie back in the bottle, because the people on the ground in those countries, whether right now, for example, in Egypt, there is a nationalist swing towards General Sisi, but do we really think that Sisi is going to be able to install become an authoritarian without the people rising up again? I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it's possible. I think we need to get past the fact that the United States and the European Union are intervening in the region in whatever way, and start looking down on the ground where civil society movements, political movements are beginning to rise up and beginning to have a say for their own voices.
What we do see in the region, gentlemen, is that from a Western perspective, hang on, guys, from a Western perspective, people vote the wrong way sometimes. You know what I mean? They're not all Jeffersonian, okay? Zayd, go ahead, because democracy is a tricky thing. You can vote for things people in the West don't like.
Go ahead. I do believe that the major change which is taking place is actually inside Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia have backed up and emphatically supported the tyrannical regime as the bastion of dictatorship. But in doing that, what has been laid bare to its own people, they have discovered that the Saudi regime is not what it has portrayed itself or depicted itself for decades, that it is the guardian and the indisputable protector of Sunni Islam, because the Saudi regime have thrown its weight, it's thrown its support behind dictatorship, and it has been spearheading at the forefront of actually supporting dictatorship, which are against the Sunni people who rose up in Egypt, Yemen and Tunisia, which have exposed this to the Saudi people. And that's why we see the Saudis going out of their way now to try to stir up and foment a sectarian war in Syria, and also extend it.
Okay, well, we'll talk about Syria in a second. Zayd, we'll talk about Syria in a second here. Oz, let me go back to Oz in Washington. I mean, this is a very interesting point. Do you think that the Western powers understands the significance of the Sunni-Shia divide? Because again, you can have Western powers interested in security, how they define it, but Riyadh looks at things in a very different way. They have a very different perspective, and it has to do with their religious faith, Wahhabism in that case, and it's something that it actively exports. And we'll talk about Syria in a second. I mean, is that a collision there that cannot be resolved?
I think that ultimately what we need to say is that the Saudi regime is actually in trouble. The Saudi regime isn't going to have the sort of money that it has now to stop stop a populist uprising taking place. So I think that means that what we need to do is keep a close eye on what's happening in Saudi politics. There is still a popular movement going on there. Now, to go directly to your question, I think that no, I don't think the divisions and understandings of the different types of Islam are fully understood in Washington, but I think it's something that over the last 10 years is becoming better understood. I think that ultimately the way it's seen here is that Saudi Arabia and Iran have tensions with each other, and that there's a global a global and a regional game going on.
Okay, Zayd, let's change gears. Let's talk about Syria here.
Right,
Again, let's move on to it. Syria. Yeah, how does Syria fit into what's been happening in the greater Middle East in the last 2 years? An exception or something very different? And some people would say that this is a block to Western influence, a penetration into the Middle East finally, and it's a game changer of one sort or another. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Yeah, what I think is a major point that we need to be acutely aware of is that the Saudi regime relies heavily on the Wahhabi Salafi religious establishment. That is the Saudi regime adheres to the Wahhabi ideology, and it is one of the main points of deception, which I think the patently deceptive myth has been unraveled now, and it's falling apart, that the Sunnis have discovered that the Saudis are trying to stir up a sectarian war in both Iraq and Syria in order to demonstrate to the Sunni people that it is engaged in an existential, engaged in combating and confronting an existential threat from the Shias, namely from Iran, in order to stave off an internal uprising. And it makes it far easier for them to pull the rug from under the feet of those people who are standing up to the Saudi regime. And that's why we've seen the Saudis throw their support behind what they perceive as a Sunni movement in Syria. But in doing so, according, that is, to the New York Times, and according to even Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, all the funding, the majority of the funding, arming, logistical support, and even paying salary, which have been exposed by the Guardians, have went to propping up, shoring up, and adding influence to Jabhat al-Nusra. They actually have created Jabhat al-Nusra, which, according to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, is part and parcel and merely an extension for Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That's why they played a prominent role, a major role in reviving and ultimately rejuvenating an Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And that's why we've seen the tremendous power, influence and prowess of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which have actually launched attack on a daily basis against the Shia in Iraq. That
agreed. Zayd, let me go to Oz here about this. I mean, is this in America's interest, in Western powers' interest, to get involved in such a conflict? Because it's an existential conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Why don't we just kind of stand back from this one? Because we're getting sucked in, or tried to get sucked in, into Syria. People criticize Obama, but I think he was smart to take Putin's idea and back off, because Western outside influencers are not going to resolve this issue in Syria. And this is why I'm asking, is it a game changer?
I think that you have to sort of understand it as multiple levels. What the diplomatic route, if we can get the Geneva II process underway, that is a positive step in the right direction. And therefore, where Western intervention should come is at the level of diplomacy. We have to get these people round the table to solve this problem. This is the greatest humanitarian crisis that we now face. Going back to your question about whether Syria is exceptional or not, I think that what you need to understand is why Syria, and in fact Libya, turned out to be violent revolutions in the way that they were. And that is, it has to do with the nature of the state. The way in which the security apparatus of those two countries was tied to the regimes itself meant that ultimately, if the regime went, the security apparatus of those countries went as well. So when Assad asked people to fire upon civilians and peaceful protesters, they will do it. In Tunisia and Egypt, that was not the case.
All right, gentlemen, I have to jump in here. I wish we had more time. Many thanks to my guests today in Washington and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules. I love you.